and they found no difference between the calorie-restricted monkeys and the monkeys who could eat as much as they wanted in terms of lifespan. Both groups lived about as long. So now the scientists were kind of in a pickle. They were like, well, one study showed that reducing calories is helpful, and the other study shows that it did absolutely nothing. So where do we stand? What is going on? Hello, angels, and welcome back to the Glucose Goddess Show. I'm still Jessie Chelsea, French biochemist, really obsessed with helping you understand your health. And today we're going to talk about fasting. So unless you've been living under a rock for the past few years, you probably have heard about intermittent fasting. It's become all the rage. Many people have tried it, but I don't think many people really know the science I'm about to talk about. So today we're going to go into the science of fasting, what actually happens when we fast. Does it really extend lifespan? Does it really help with cancer prevention? Does it help with metabolism, with weight loss? What are the main drawbacks, if any, of fasting? And if you're somebody who likes fasting, some very important things that you absolutely need to know. Otherwise, you might not be helping yourself. So let's dive into it. I'm very excited for this topic. So first, fasting and lifespan. This is one of the first things that I heard about in the science of fasting, that fasting extends our lifespan. You might have heard of this. And this belief actually comes from a long time ago. Let me tell you the timeline of the connection between fasting and extending our lifespan. So it's actually a study done on rats that started this belief that fasting could extend your lifespan. The study is called Effects of Intermittent Feeding Upon Growth and Lifespan in Rats. Easy. It was done on 28 male rats in 1982. A while back. And this is what happened. The scientists found that the average lifespan of the rats was increased by up to 80%. They lived twice as long, almost, when they were put on a regimen of alternate day fasting. So one day they could eat, the next day they couldn't eat, and like this, starting when they became young adults, I think. Yeah, young adults. So this was the beginning of the research that said, hey, maybe reducing how much we eat or fasting or reducing calories can, in fact, extend lifespan. And this was a very exciting study when it came out. But here's the problem. It was then not completely able to be replicated. So for example, there's a meta-analysis, which is a big study that looks at many other studies and analyzes them. There's one that looked at data from 1934 to 2012. And this meta-analysis was called Dietary Restriction in Rats and Mice, a meta-analysis and review of the evidence for genotype-dependent effects on lifespan. And they showed not as good as results as that first study have found. They showed that caloric restriction increases lifespan in rats by 14 to 45%, down from 80% lifespan expansion in that other study. And that in mice, it was yet another story, and that caloric restriction only increased lifespan up to 27% in mice. So already, it's a bit murky as to whether that first study was able to be completely replicated. The data was a bit all over the place. It's not clear that every time you put rat or mice on an intermittent fasting, alternate day fasting regimen, that they automatically live almost twice as long. So that was really important. So it's not super conclusive that in rats and mice, reducing calories or fasting automatically extends lifespan. We really don't have very clear data showing that this happens every single time. That's really important to know. Now, scientists thought, hey, what if we tested this on monkeys? Because monkeys are genetically quite close to humans, and they wanted to know if this research was going to be applicable to humans. So taking a rat study and extrapolating it to humans is not so easy because obviously we are not rats. But when you look at a monkey study, you can start to draw conclusions that might be more applicable to humans. So as a result, two massive research studies started. Time for a quick break to tell you about the supplement I have developed, Anti-Spike Formula. Now listen, in my years of research, I've understood one key thing. Keeping our glucose levels steady is the foundation of physical and mental health, no question. And if I could only take one supplement for the rest of my life to help me reduce my glucose spikes and keep my glucose levels steady, it would be Anti-Spike Formula. I created Anti-Spike with two really powerful natural plant molecules in it. The first one is mulberry leaf extract. And listen to this. In a review study of 12 randomized clinical trials on over 600 people, scientists found that mulberry leaf extract significantly reduces our glucose spikes after a meal by up to 40%. It also significantly reduces our insulin spike after a meal by up to 40%, and it reduces our fasting glucose levels by 8 milligrams per deciliter after just 2 months. So this molecule from mulberry leaf reduces the absorption of glucose in our bloodstream. It actually slows down how quickly starches turn to glucose in our bloodstream, therefore creating a massive reduction in the glucose spike of our meal. The second main molecule in Anti-Spike Formula is a molecule from lemon called eriocitrine. It's the molecule that makes lemons yellow, but it also has a really cool effect on our gut. It basically helps our gut produce more GLP-1. Clinical trials show us that GLP-1 production increases by 17% after just 2 months of taking it. More GLP-1 means healthier glucose levels. I take 2 capsules of Anti-Spike Formula every single day before the meal of my day highest in carbs and sugars. So go to antispike.com to see all the science behind these ingredients, to see testimonials from thousands of people who've tried it, and to order your own Anti-Spike Formula bottle and try it for yourself. The scientists use a specific type of monkey that is 93% genetically identical to humans. And there were 2 big studies, okay? The first one was at the University of Wisconsin that started in 1989 and lasted 20 years. This study was done on 76 monkeys, okay? And it showed, in fact, a positive effect on lifespan when they restricted the calories that the monkeys were able to eat. So they had 2 groups, essentially, one that was calorie restricted and one that could eat as much as they wanted. And this study showed that in the monkeys, reducing calories did extend lifespan. Interesting, right? But here's the catch. Another study that started in the US around the same time at the NIH, started in 1987, was a 23-year-old long study on 34 monkeys. It was published in Nature, which is a very big journal and prestigious journal. They did basically the same study design, and they found no difference between the calorie-restricted monkeys and the monkeys who could eat as much as they wanted in terms of lifespan. Both groups lived about as long. So now the scientists were kind of in a pickle. They were like, well, one study showed that reducing calories is helpful, and the other study shows that it did absolutely nothing. So where do we stand? What is going on? Here's the big difference in the studies. In the study at the University of Wisconsin, where reducing calories increased lifespan in the monkeys, the diet of the monkeys was highly processed and high in sugar. In the NIH study, where there was no difference in lifespan between the 2 groups, the diet was much, much healthier. So this pointed to a hypothesis which said, well, maybe if your diet is really healthy, reducing calories doesn't actually have that big of an impact on your lifespan. But if your diet is unhealthy, high in processed carbs, high in sugars, essentially high in stuff that's going to harm your health, then reducing calories can help you live longer. I find this so interesting because without even knowing it, these 2 studies gave us an amazing insight, which says that it's not just reducing calories. It's not just fasting alone. It also depends on what you're eating the rest of the time, what your diet is. So if you're looking to extend your lifespan, Fasting might not be the solution. We don't have good data showing that it actually works. However, if you do want to increase your lifespan, here's what you need to do. We have very strong data that exercising, I know, boring, but true, that exercising could increase your lifespan by up to 7 years. So if you exercise regularly, well, a lot, you can live up to 7 years longer with fewer diseases. So that should put things into perspective, right? So lifespan extension, exercising. Honestly, exercising is one of the best things you can do for your health. I know it's boring, but like that's just the case. So exercise instead of fast if your goal is lifespan. And many studies that I'll put in the description of this episode have showed essentially that regular exercises like runners and cyclists live as much as a decade longer than sedentary people. So it's 7 years to 10 years longer than people who do not exercise. And of course, with fewer diseases that are associated with metabolic health. Cool, huh? Okay, so that was the lifespan part of this episode. We don't have clear data, but what do we have data on when it comes to fasting? Don't worry, there's lots of cool stuff I want to talk about. So many studies have come out recently showing that intermittent fasting, which means like not eating for specific time periods during the day, essentially reducing the time windows during which you eat. So this could be, for example, eating only for 6 hours during the day and the rest of the time not eating at all. Or it could be eating only for 12 hours during the day and the rest of the day not eating at all. There's a huge 2019 review study called Effects of Intermittent Fasting on Health, Aging, and Disease. And this great study review goes through all the benefits of fasting on our health. And I'm going to get into them now. So let's talk about the benefits of fasting on our health. The main first benefit of fasting on people's health has to do with one of my favorite topics, glucose and insulin levels. So little recap. Every time you eat carbs, so that's starches like bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, oats, or sugars, anything from an apple juice to a chocolate ice cream, these contain glucose. Carbs contain glucose. And when you eat a lot of them, they create a glucose spike in your bloodstream. These glucose spikes can be damaging, so as a result, your body sends out a hormone called insulin. Insulin's job is to grab the excess glucose and store it away. Insulin is amazing. It's very helpful. But if you have too much insulin in your body over time, it leads to many health complications, one of them being type 2 diabetes. So you want to keep your insulin levels down. And the more you eat carbs, the higher the glucose and the insulin response. This is an example of eating 1 cookie versus eating 20 cookies. The amount you eat matters. As you can tell, the 1 cookie glucose spike is much smaller than the 20 cookie glucose spike. As a result, 1 cookie is going to release less insulin than 20 cookies. This is kind of common sense, right? If you eat less of the stuff that's going to secrete insulin in your body, you're going to have less insulin in your body and it's going to help your health. And this is why studies show that daily caloric restriction, so eating less overall throughout the day, or intermittent fasting, 24 hours fasting 3 times a week, was able to reverse high insulin levels in people with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. It makes perfect sense that eating less of the stuff that got you to that condition in the first place is going to help you reverse it. But fasting is not the only solution to achieve this. You could also eat differently. You could use my glucose hacks, for example, link in the description of this episode, to change how, when, and what combination you're eating your foods to reduce your glucose spikes and your insulin levels without fasting. This is a very key nuance, okay? There's multiple routes to Rome. There's multiple routes that'll get you to be able to reverse type 2 diabetes. Eating less of the stuff that's bad, yes, but also eating differently. Now, the thing is, there's even more nuance to this because studies also show us that if we don't change what we're eating and we don't change how much we're eating, but if we eat the exact same amount of food in shorter eating windows throughout the day, so instead of eating your overall 2,000 calories in 6 meals, you eat them in, let's say, 3 meals, this is also going to help reduce your insulin levels and help with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So step 1 is to try to condense your eating into smaller eating windows. So avoid snacking, for example. And step 2 is to change what you're eating using my glucose hacks. That would get you to a really good outcome. Okay, another really key thing that happens when you fast is a process called metabolic flexibility. So our bodies at any moment can use two things for fuel and for energy. They can be using glucose or they can be using fat for fuel. Now, if you have to snack every 2 hours, if you're constantly hungry, if you can't go 5, 6, 7 hours without eating, without becoming shaky or lightheaded, you're probably not very metabolically flexible, meaning your body is not very good at burning fat for fuel. And this is not just like a weight loss thing. This is very important for your health because as your body burns fat for fuel, it uses what's called ketones. And ketones are great fuel that help our brain too. So when we fast, we force our body to become better at switching to using fat for fuel because we're not giving it glucose all the time. So after a little while, your glucose reserves are completely depleted and your body has to learn to use fat for fuel. Now, it can be quite extreme to force your body to do that by just fasting for a long time. You can also teach your body metabolic flexibility simply by spiking your glucose levels a bit less. And again, this is a good time if you don't know my glucose hacks to download my free PDF of my glucose hacks in the description of this episode because they can help you with this. So second advantage of fasting is increasing metabolic flexibility. Third big advantage of fasting is something called autophagy. So the image I like to use to explain autophagy is, let's say you got fired from your job and you need to find money somewhere because your bank account is very low in cash, right? The first thing you might do is go throughout your house and kind of look around and say, hey, do I really need this blender? Do I really need this old thing lying around here? Can I sell anything for money? So the idea of going through your old stuff and seeing if you can sell any of it is quite similar to autophagy. So when we haven't eaten in a long time, our body does this process of looking inside and saying, hey, are there any old cells here that I can recycle and process to be able to reuse? And that's exactly what autophagy is. So autophagy comes from auto, that means self, and phagy, that means eating. So when you fasted for a long time, your body starts breaking down old damaged cells. And this is really cool because it basically does like a big spring cleaning of everything inside of your body, helps it renew, helps it be healthier. Autophagy is really good and is super helpful. Now, it's important to note that autophagy is always happening in your body, okay? But when you fast, you increase how much it's happening. So that's a really good side effect of fasting. And another cool thing is that a lot of studies have shown that autophagy also helps us in the case of cancer because a lot of cancers start from old damaged cells. So when autophagy happens, cleans up all those old damaged cells, that could potentially become problematic. So there's a wonderful study, a 2023 paper in Nature called Autophagy and Autophagy-Related Pathways in Cancer. And it explains this process very well. And it concludes by saying, it is now widely accepted that autophagy suppresses tumor initiation. Again, importantly, autophagy is always happening in your body. It's not something that just happens when you fast. It's an important process that's taking place constantly. But one of the benefits of fasting is that you kind of rev that up. And that's why studies are also showing that in the case of cancer treatment, fasting can actually be helpful. There's another study called Cyclic Fasting Mimicking Diet in Cancer Treatment, Preclinical and Clinical Evidence that shows us that if you have cancer, there are some associations between fasting and better results in your treatment, which is super cool. And another thing also is that autophagy happens everywhere in your body, also in your brain. And one other interesting study, I know there's so many studies on this, but I don't want to overwhelm you with the studies, but they're so cool. So another study is called The Effect of Caloric Restriction on Working Memory in healthy, non-obese adults. And this was a randomized clinical trial that showed that 2 years of daily caloric restriction led to a significant improvement in working memory. And the scientists hypothesized that this was because of the autophagy happening in the brain, cleaning out all the old brain cells. Of course, it could also be because the people were eating less bad food by just eating less. And that's also really helpful for our brain because we know that too much sugar, for example, really impacts our neurons and our brains. There's also a 2023 study that showed in mice, in mouse models, but in mice, that in mice with Alzheimer's disease, intermittent fasting could actually improve their memory and help them reverse some cognitive decline. Now, of course, this is in mice, so take it with a big, big grain of salt, but there's really interesting data here showing us that it could be helpful. However, in this mice study, I don't know whether the mice were otherwise fed a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet. So again, you have to take everything with balance, like what are they eating the rest of the time? But super interesting, and autophagy is great. You guys know I've been doing my glucose hacks religiously. They are the foundation of my dietary habits, but adding the molecules and anti-spike has really allowed me to get to the next level in a few areas. One, bloating. I didn't even know that I would get bloated. With anti-spike, I'm like, oh, I used to get bloated. I feel so much better now. 2, energy levels, super consistent. Eagle energy all day. And 3, cravings for sugar. I love sugar. I want to eat chocolate all the time. And anti-spike has given me a feeling of having a total superpower when it comes to my sugar cravings. I don't feel controlled by them anymore at all. It's truly amazing. And I know that these natural molecules are going to help my long-term fasting glucose and fasting insulin levels, which is so key to physical and mental health and to healthy aging. So go to antispike.com to see all the science behind these ingredients, to see testimonials from thousands of people who've tried it, and to order your own anti-spike formula bottle and try it for yourself. Fasting has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of good rep, and sometimes it feels to me like it is touted as a bit of a miracle solution. It has good effects on the body for sure, but there are also very big drawbacks that you need to be aware of if you are fasting. And the first drawback has to do with our muscles. And as you know, muscles are very important. Let's look at our muscles. So it's important to understand that when we do prolonged fasting, our body is going to start to break down our muscles to meet its protein needs, because our body needs a lot of protein every single day. And if we're not eating any protein, your body will have to find the protein somewhere. And the place that is the big store of protein in our body is our muscles. So it's so important to remember that if you're fasting, it is so key to eat the rest of the time when you're eating enough protein to meet those needs. Otherwise, the fasting is going to lead to, sure, some advantages and some fat loss, but also muscle loss. And that's not a good thing for our body. There's a sentence here that I love that I want you to remember. The fewer calories you consume, the more these calories should come in the form of dietary protein. And if your goal is to live longer and healthier, you need to prioritize your muscle mass. This is so key. There's a 10-year observational study of about 4,500 people, ages 50 and older. The study is called Associations of Muscle Mass and Strength with All-Cause Mortality Among U.S. Older Adults. And this study found that people with low muscle mass were 40 to 50% more likely to die than others. 40 to 50% more likely to die if they had low muscle mass. And further analysis in this study showed that it's not just the muscle mass, it's actually the strength of your muscles that is a better determinant of lifespan. So if you're fasting, if you like to do intermittent fasting, if you like to skip breakfast, if you like to do 16/8, if you like to do whatever type of fasting, you have to make sure that when you're eating enough protein. And the objective should be about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. This is much more than the guidelines currently say, but this is the amount you need to be able to thrive. So if you weigh 150 pounds like me, you need 150 grams of protein every single day. That's a lot of protein. 1 egg is about 7-ish grams of protein. So it's a lot of protein. If you want some help figuring out how much protein you need to eat, whether you're fasting or not fasting, I have a link in the description of this episode that's going to help you, 1, calculate your protein demands based on your kilos or your pounds of body weight. And 2, we'll show you lots of examples of which foods contain which amount of protein. So for example, in my own life, every single meal I have, I'm always thinking first, where is the protein coming from? You have to consciously make an effort of eating enough protein. It's not just going to happen on its own because eating enough protein It's kind of a lot of work. You have to get into the habit of making sure you're getting enough protein every single meal. This is so, so, so important. Another thing is there's a small study that found that people who do alternate day fasting, so eating on one day and fasting the other day, constantly alternating like this, that they lost weight, but they lost way more muscle mass than people who just ate 25% fewer calories every single day. So it seems like the most damaging thing to your muscle mass is to fast for a long period of time. And it kind of makes sense, right? The longer you go without eating, the more your body needs to find protein somewhere. So the more likely it's going to go and use up your muscles. So most people today, you have to remember, they eat a lot of starch and a lot of sugar, and they already have quite low muscle mass. So by adding in fasting in there, they might just end up losing even more muscle mass. And in this case, I think it's not a very good trade-off. It would be better to fix what you're eating so that you increase your muscle mass, you help your body, you help your health, instead of reverting to fasting without having the knowledge of how to maintain your muscle mass, because you could end up in a worse situation than before if fasting is going to lead to you just losing a lot of your muscle mass. I hope that makes sense. Now let's move on to the next important drawback about fasting, which is all about how to break your fast. So what is the first thing you eat after you've been fasting? And this applies not only to eating after you've just woken up and you've fasted for 10, 12 hours overnight, or if you've been fasting for, 5 days and you're going to start eating again. After we've been fasting, our digestive system is really, really empty. So if you look at your stomach and your intestines, after fasting, there's nothing in them. They're very sensitive. They're excited to get some food. So the first thing you're going to eat is going to arrive very quickly into your bloodstream. So if you eat something that's high in starches and sugars, like a fruit smoothie, it's going to cause a much bigger glucose spike on an empty stomach than it would, say, after a main meal. So how you refuel after fasting is key. You should never refuel after fasting or break your fast with something sweet. Never, because this is going to create a big glucose spike and big consequences on your health. You should be thinking about protein and fiber. So what I like to say is that your breakfast should always be a savory breakfast built around protein. You can get some free savory breakfast recipes in the description of this episode, but the whole point of a savory breakfast is to keep your blood sugar levels steady and to avoid a big spike. So build your breakfast around protein, okay? Now, a question I often get is like, well, Jessie, I fast in the morning and I don't have breakfast. So does this still apply? Yes, the first meal of your day should be savory, regardless of when that meal is, whether it's at 7 a.m. or it's at 1 p.m. or it's after 2 days of fasting. That first meal should always be savory. And if you can, an even better thing to start with would actually be some veggies, because when we eat veggies first at the beginning of a meal, they have time to create a protective mesh in our upper intestine that's going to prevent any glucose spike from happening afterwards. So think savory, think protein, and if you can, for example, if it's at lunchtime, have a little green salad or a little bit of broccoli beforehand. That's going to help even better. So what can we learn from this? We can learn that it's very key to understand when you should be eating starches and sugars. You should always avoid them on an empty stomach. You should always avoid them at the beginning of a meal. Try to have them after proteins and fats and fibers, towards the end of a meal. And try to avoid having sugar ever between your meals. Sugar should only be dessert. It should not be your breakfast. It should not be a snack. Sugar is for dessert. Lastly, when it comes to females of reproductive age, it's important to remember that fasting is a stressor on the body. So if you drink coffee, have a stressful job, have, kids to take care of at home, you do cardio and high intensity interval training, and you do saunas and you do cold plunges, and maybe something is going on in your life that is stressing you out for X or Y reason, and whatever, adding fasting as an extra stressor might be too much for your body to handle. So my advice is never fast if it feels difficult. I sometimes fast when I'm on vacation, for example, because I'm super chill and it's super easy. But if I'm going through life like I usually do, which means doing a lot of stuff all the time, having to deal with lots of people and problems and situations, I don't fast because I remember that's a stressor on my body. I once met a young woman who had polycystic ovary syndrome, and she came up to me and she was like, "Oh, I'm doing all the things right. Like I'm fasting 16 hours a day, and I'm doing boot camp 4 days a week, and I don't eat any sugar and any carbs, and I drink coffee, and I do sauna, and I do cold plunge, and I'm not getting my period." I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Have you, spoken to your doctor about maybe the fact that this is too many stressors on your body?" So remember, fasting is a stressor. If you love doing it, do it at the right time so it doesn't cause any stress that you cannot handle. So let's do a little recap of what we learned. Fasting is not a magic pill. If you're fasting 16 hours a day, but the rest of the time you're only eating chocolate and candy and I don't know, like pizza, you're not going to be in a good situation. Fasting does not erase a bad diet. Really, the better and harder thing to do would be to look at your diet and see how you can change it so that it becomes healthier for you. And yes, science shows us that many good things happen when we're fasting. Lower insulin levels, better metabolic health, metabolic flexibility, autophagy ramps up, and that's great. But if the rest of the time you're ignoring your protein intake and you're losing your muscle mass, it might not be such a good trade-off. So we have to be aware and educated if we fast. It's not just like a magic pill, a magic switch you just turn on. You have to be educated, which is what I'm hoping this video will do. So if you're a faster, remember, the rest of the time, eat protein, because the fewer calories you consume, the more of these calories should come in the form of dietary protein. This is so key. Then think about how you're breaking your fast. Never break your fast with something sweet or something starchy. That's going to just cause some damage that doesn't really need to be there. And finally, it depends where you're coming from. If you're somebody who's healthy, who has a very healthy diet already, fasting might not actually give you any advantages. If you're already in a state of like really good metabolic health, you don't have any chronic conditions, then you might really not need to do it. However, if you're somebody who's struggling with a long-term chronic illness, like a type 2 diabetes or something like that, then speak to your doctor, because it could be helpful for you to potentially fast just to be able to reduce how much of the quote-unquote unhelpful and unhealthy food you're putting in your body in the first place. And to close this off, I will just mention a 2021 umbrella review of multiple clinical trials that showed that various fasting methods, like alternate day fasting, time-restricted eating, led to improvements in metabolic health, particularly in people with obesity. So the benefits of fasting are almost proportional to the state of health in your body. So the healthier you are, the fewer the benefits. The more unhealthy you are, the higher the benefits. I hope that's clear. So things we can learn, everybody can learn whether you're fasting or not. Avoid snacking. Try to condense your meals into real meals and have dessert instead of snacks. Think about how you're breaking your fast, even just overnight, because breakfast is a breaking of the fast that every single one of us does every day. And now some free resources for you guys. In the description of this episode, we have the PDF with my 10 hacks if you want to get those insulin levels down without fasting. And you have my protein master explainer, where you can measure how much protein you need to be eating every day, and then what kinds of foods can help you get to that goal. Let me know what you think. It was so fun to do this episode. I hope you enjoyed the science, and I'll see you next time.